Hello coders, welcome back to the Java series. In this video, we are going to be showing you how to create data types and variables in Java. So data types are basically structures that allow us to store some sort of data. In Java, you have two types of data. So there's the primitive data types and non-primitive data types. Your primitive data types includes 8 different data types. These includes byte, short, int, long, float, double, boolean, and char. With the primitive data types, most of them deal with storing numbers. So double, float, long, int, short, and byte all are used to store numbers. But the most common number data type that coders use is going to be int, double, or float. In my case, my two favorite are int and double, and that's what I will be using primarily in this Java series. The other two primitive data types, boolean and char, are used to store other values. For your boolean, that is used to store the value of true or false, and char is used to store a single character or letter or symbol that is on your keyboard. So those are going to be your primitive data types. You will also have your non-primitive data types, which are going to deal with things such as strings, arrays, and classes, all of which we'll deep dive into later on in this lesson. So first, let's go ahead and get started with creating our class. In the last video, I showed you how to do that, so in case you missed that video, please go look at the last video, but I will show you exactly how to create the class here as well. So the first thing you want to do is public, and then you want to do class, and then you want to name the class exactly what your file is named, which mine is called data type variables. And then you want to follow that with curly braces. Now inside of here, we want to put our main method, and that's going to be public static void main string brackets args, and end it with curly braces. So now we have our class and we have our main method. I'm going to go ahead and add a comment that's going to say program to work with data types and variables. All right, now I'm going to go into my main method and we'll start here. So the first thing I want to do is simply get started with data types. So we'll start with our primitive data types. And our primitive data types are typically the ones that are going to work with storing numbers, characters, or the value of true and false. So the first thing you need to know is the syntax that's involved with creating these data types. And let me go ahead and just blow it up a little bit for us. All right, so our syntax. Our syntax is the rule of how we should utilize the data types. So in Java, we're going to first put the data type that we want to use and follow it by a name. So you would do the data type, and then you would say the variable name, and then you would say equals the value, and semicolon. So a variable is something that is used to store some piece of information that is in Java. The variable is going to hold a certain value. So the variable could be a string, it could be a number, it could be another object, it could be many different things. But a variable is just pretty much going to store information, and we can then call this variable in the future instead of continuously typing out whatever the value is. So for us to work with the data types, we have to first specify what the data type is and then give it a variable name and then give it a value. So first we will work with numbers. So the first thing I want to do is work with the int. Int means integer. So that's the data type for int. It must be all lowercase to work. And then I have to give it that variable name. So we'll say number 1. Then we'll say equals, and let's give it a number. So right now we have a variable called number 1, variable of data type int, called number 1. All right, so that's just a comment to tell us what's going on, but basically we just create a variable of the data type int that is called number 1, and number 1 is holding 28. So anytime we want to use the number 28, we could just say number 1. I'll go ahead and create another example so we can work with the float, or let's work with double. And we'll say number 2 is going to equal 2. And with a double, your double typically works with decimals. So anything that you want your decimal to work with in this case is going to be like if you have some sort of change, or if you're working with fractions, you could use a double. So in this case, we would do 12.08. And that's going to be variable data type double called number 2. All right. So there's an example of that. And that is our 2 variables with numbers. And you also have the Boolean data type. Now this is going to be true or false. So this is in case you want to store the values of true or false. But to use this, you would say Boolean, and TF value is going to be the name we use for this. And then we're going to say equals 2, and in this case, we're going to write either true or false. Now for this, yes, it is text, but we do not have to use the quotes because it's not a string, it is a Boolean value. So we could simply just type true or false with no quotes, and in this case, I'll type false. And remember to end it with your semicolon. And this is going to be a Boolean variable. So now we have an example of our Boolean data type. Then we also have the char data type. And this can be a letter or a symbol. So that would be char symbol 1 is going to equal. And in this case, you use the single quotes, and let's put that as an exclamation mark. And now we have a symbol. So if you use char, You are not supposed to use anything other than just one symbol, one letter, or one number. You want to make sure it's also enclosed in the single quotes so that it understands that it's a char. So here we have a char variable. And then we also have the string. So with our string, we are going to create that. So when you work with strings, which is text, you want to specify that it's a string, and then you can say string 1 is equal to hello. And that is going to be our string variable. All right. So now we have created an example of all of the common permutative data types and even non-permutative data types. Your string is going to be the non-permutative data type. There are other data types as well, as I mentioned, but I don't want to confuse you. I just want to show you the most common ones that you'll probably need to use in your code so that you don't get confused. So now that we've created these variables, you can use them in different ways. In this case, we can use them in print statements if we would like. So we could say printing variables. So if you wanted to print these out, you would have to use print statements. And if you remember from the last video, that will be system.out.print line. And then you'll start it off like that. For now, I'm going to copy this so I don't have to keep typing it. And then I'll reuse that as I need it. So when you're printing your variables, you need to place the variable name inside of the parentheses. So if you look, we have number 1, 2, we have TF value, symbol 1, and string 1. So let's print them out one at a time. The first one we have is number 1. The next one we want to print out is going to be, grab that. It's going to be number 2. We're going to paste that again and change the value. The next one is going to be TF value. Then we also have the symbol 1. Here, symbol 1. And then we have string 1. So string 1. So here we have print statements to print all of the variables out that we're using. And just something to make our output look more readable would be a print statement to tell the user what we are seeing. So we could simply do a print statement here, system.out.print line, and we could say printing variables. So then that will let us know what is going on in our output. And now we have our variable print examples that we can work with. And this is how you create and print variables in Java. You can also use them combined with strings and other information, but we're not using that just yet. So that's just something I wanted to point out as well. So there's one thing you want to note when you're working with variables. Your variables must start with a letter or underscore. And do not use symbols inside of your variable names. Your variables also should not contain spaces. So when you're doing that, you also need to know that variables are case sensitive as well, which means that if you have a capital letter or a lowercase letter, it doesn't matter if the word is the exact same, it's still two different variables. So I'll go ahead and show you the example with case sensitive variables. So an example of this would be if we were to create, let's say, an int called num1, and we'll say that's equal to 9. If you were to create another variable called num1, then you would see that those are two different variables. Yes, they say the same thing, but because one starts with the lowercase and one starts with uppercase, that makes them two different variables. So you need to be cautious when you're naming or typing in your variable names. So in this case, we now have two new variables, num1 and num1, but one with the lowercase letter and one with a capital. So in the case where you want to use multiple words in your variable name, you can use what's called camel casing. So camel casing is when you will basically have a lowercase word to start off your variable name and then follow it by an uppercase word. It's basically making a hump, which is what we refer to as the camel casing, as it's creating a hump and it's allowing you to easily see the different words. So in this example, we could say string and we'll put first name equals Tom. Now, the camel casing is basically, as you see with the T and the N in first name, that we uppercase that next word. So instead of us putting a space, we just made that next word capitalized, so it's easier to read on the eyes. Yes, typically you would have a space there, but as you know, in variables you can't use spaces, so you just need to take that into consideration. If there's ever a case where you need to use multiple words in a variable name, just use camel casing so it's easier to read for you. So now we have some examples of case-sensitive variables and also camel casing. So we'll go ahead and print those out. Now while I am typing in this information, remember when you are creating your variables not to use any Java reserved words. And reserved words or keywords are basically the words that are used in Java for special uses or special purposes. So you want to make sure you're not using any of those. And in this case, we have some already like int, string, char. You should never use these in your variable name. System as well. So there's actually a lot of different keywords out there. So I highly suggest you look into those to know what to use in your variable names and what not to use. But I did just want to point that out. So in case you ever create a variable and you're doing it as instructed in this video, but you're still getting error, consider that you might have been using a keyword. So now I'm going to finish printing out the variables I created. System.out.print line num1 with a capital this time. And we also have the first name. And I'll just paste this one this time and type in first name. Now, yes, you are learning from this video, and if I were you, I would copy everything I'm doing in this video because the more you practice, the more it'll make sense, the more it'll understand for you. Um, that's the goal. When you're learning coding, you have to literally practice, 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 practice. That's the most important part. So make sure you practice all the time to get the hang of coding. So before I end this video, I want to cover two more things in this example. So first, I want to cover what I call constants, or what Java world calls constants. So constants, and they are the variables that can't change. So in this case, a variable that can't change is going to be utilized in your code. What types of variables would you not want to change? For example, you wouldn't change a person's name. You might not want to change their address. You might not want to change their ID number or their phone number, certain things like that. So there are some cases in your code where you may not want to change the name or have the value changed. If that's the case, you need to use the keyword final. And final would go before the data type. So it would look like this. So in the case of a name, so we'll do last name, we'll say final string last name is going to equal Roberts. So now we have created a constant. Because we placed that keyword final in front of it, that means it cannot be changed. Is the constant required? No, but there are some cases in your program code where you may want variables to remain the same value. So that is when you use final. So I just thought I would introduce that in case there's ever a time where you want to create some sort of variable and not change the code. So that's going to be our constant. And then you also have the possibility to convert your data types. So if, for example, you want to turn a double to an int, so let's say you have int num1, which we do already on line 22, and let's say we want to change a int to a double. And to do that, we would say double, and I'll put double 1 is going to equal to num1. Now that is basically going to change the value of num1 from an int to a double. So if you simply create a variable with a new data type and assign another data type, it will change. So this is going to work with most of your number values. I would not do this with a string, as working to convert strings require a little bit more work to change. Yes, it can be done, but it will require a little bit of work to change it from converting it from an integer to a string, or converting a string to an integer. So I don't want to get into that right now. I probably cover that when we get into the strings lesson. But this is an example of converting from a double to a from an int to a double. So just keep that in mind as you're working with your variables if you have to change them in the future. So overall, we've covered, if we go back to the top, we've covered working with our primitive data types like ints, doubles, booleans, and chars. And we worked with a non-primitive data type of a string. We've covered case-sensitive variables and camel casing. and we've also covered constants and converting data types, specifically number data types. And we've covered how to print these variables out. So now if we just go ahead and run this program, we'll see what our output shows. And here you see we have all of our variables that we wrote. Well, not all of them because I didn't print out the last two we created, but we do have most of them. And it printed it out to us to the screen, and these are the variables we created. So hopefully this was a simple lesson. Hopefully it wasn't too hard. I do hope that you took notes and maybe even try this yourself to get a better understanding. And hopefully this content wasn't too hard for you to understand. As we progress through this series, a lot of the topics we are going to cover will start to have common themes, which you will see variables will be in most of the remaining videos. Print statements will also be in there, main method, comments, etc. So everything we're learning in this video will be in all of the remaining videos. So I do suggest you practice creating these and understanding how they work so that you will not get confused in future videos. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.